Good morning, everyone, and thank you. If you're wanting to attend the managed transition away from fossil fuels, and who isn't, and what is required, you're in the right place.
Do not stay here anyway.
Yeah, there you go. You might learn something. This is a joint program of the Climate Registry and the Climate Center. And I want to thank the Climate Registry for hosting us, Amy Holm and her team, Tess and Lauren for doing all the hard work to make one of these pavilions come together at COP, which I know is considerable because I had half of that role last time. So thank you all. And I'm going to just do a quick introduction before we get to the meat of things. Of myself. My name is Barry Vesser. I'm at the Climate Center. I'm our Chief Operating Officer, and the Climate Center is a California nonprofit that works in Sacramento on clean energy and climate policy. And our belief is, as goes California, so goes the world. So thank you all for being here because you are the ones driving the change. And I'm gonna just start us with the next slide about why are we talking about a managed transition? Can you load that next slide, please? There we go, thanks. So California is a climate leader. And a lot of really good things are happening in the state. We're going to hear about some of those things today. I'm very proud to be a Californian. And there's a lot we still need to do. And this is the way we're sort of conceptualizing where we need to go. A managed transition means a global perspective on a collaborative, comprehensive, and coordinated managed transition away from fossil fuels. So why do we need that? Well, let's just step back a little bit for some global perspective. The International Energy Agency tells us we must stop building new oil and gas infrastructure 2 years ago if we want to get to a 1.5C future. The IEA forecasts that global upstream oil and gas investments are going to increase about 11% this year, or $528 billion. That's the highest level since 2015. So we are not decreasing. A recent UN Environmental Program report notes that governments currently plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 that would be possible on a pathway consistent with staying below 2C, much less 1.5C. And finally, the IMF this year told us that governments worldwide are giving subsidies worth $7 trillion, that's trillion with a T, to oil and gas interests. Now, getting back to my beloved progressive California, California is runaway the highest consumer of gas in the United States. We rank number 7 in terms of oil producing states in the United States. We make available to oil and gas interests about $8 billion in subsidies, give or take. We could go spend a long time talking about the accounting for that, but that's a rough figure. California is still issuing new oil and gas extraction permits, although those have slowed down, and we're grateful for that. And California is still a major importer of crude oil and then an exporter of finished refined products. So that's the context. Why a managed transition? This is all happening anyway, right? We're getting there. I think is the feeling. Even if we're not getting there fast enough, it feels like we're getting there. So abrupt refinery closures are not good for workers, their families, or the communities that are dependent on them. Abrupt, unplanned closures can cause consumer price spikes and other social and economic disruptions. And local governments need time to transition away from a tax base that's dependent on fossil fuel revenue. So all of those three things are not just realities that we have to deal with in the real world, but they're also the potential for political backlash against our climate efforts that we need to be mindful of and that we need to plan for. And then finally, the reason to accelerate this is because approximately 1 in 5 deaths worldwide are attributed to fossil fuels or the combustion of fossil fuels, according to a 2021 Harvard study. And that comes out to be about 34,000 per year in California. So there are a lot of good reasons why the government has a strong role in helping with this transition and can make this transition less painful for all parties involved. And so this last thing I'm going to say before we turn to our panelists is the governor, the legislature, and agencies must set California a managed path to phase out fossil fuel gas production in line with the state's climate goals, commensurate with the declines in demand and with a just and equitable transition to protect workers and their families and communities. That's what we believe at the Climate Center. And I want to say I've been focusing on California. We are a California-based policy nonprofit, but California is emblematic of the world in this case, certainly the United States. So solving these issues is hugely important and something that we can do as a contribution to other subnational and national actors. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker. So Chair Liane Randolph, who's on my far right here, is the chair of the California Air Resources Board, and CARB, I would say, is certainly a good candidate for the most important agency addressing climate change in California. CARB lays out California's path to carbon neutrality by 2045 with a scoping plan process that happens every 5 years. In addition, develops regulations that will accelerate the transition to zero-emission transportation system and many, many, many other things. Chair Randolph is a very busy person. Prior to her work at CARB, the chair also served as a commissioner at the California Public Utilities Commission. So she has a really very refined understanding of the electricity system in California. And there's a relationship between a managed decline on the one hand and getting 100% renewable electricity on our grid on the other. She also has a Juris Doctor degree from the University of California, Los Angeles, and the School of Law. So Chair Randolph, I hope that you will talk to us a little bit about something you said a little over a year ago, which was that you thought that California needed a managed plan for transition. What do you think is needed? And what obstacles do you see to getting there from your vantage point?
So thank you so much for...
Is that on?
Am I on? I'm on. Thank you so much for having me to talk about how we transition to a zero emission economy. First of all, I said that in the context of the scoping plan. The scoping plan is our climate plan to transition to carbon neutrality by 2045. And in order to do that, the first thing we need to do is aggressively reduce demand for fossil fuels. So a lot of the work in the scoping plan is focused on that demand reduction. It is focused on all of our vehicle regulations, getting to 100% light duty vehicles by 2035, our advanced clean trucks regulation, which is a manufacturer requirement for manufacturers to introduce increasing amounts of zero emission trucks into California. And then our advanced clean fleets regulation, which is a companion regulation that the manufacturers really asked us to consider because they wanted to make sure there was going to be a market for those zero emission trucks. And so we adopted our advanced clean fleets regulation that requires fleets to purchase increasing numbers of zero emission vehicles. In addition, the scoping plan includes strategies such as building decarbonization, so we can move away from gas appliances and more towards zero emission electric appliances. And of course, the scoping plan includes a suite of other strategies. But I think in the context of the transition conversation, as we were drafting the scoping plan, I was sort of looking at this, thinking about that export statement you made about, California does export a lot of finished fuels. So as we reduce the demand, there is not a guarantee that the supply is necessarily going to be reduced in California unless we are intentional, right? Unless we say, what are the steps we need to take to address how to transition away from supplying fossil fuels in the state, which means a lot of things. It means how do we support workforce transition? How do we ensure that there are technologies of the future that are creating good jobs, and that those jobs have the same strong benefits that fossil fuel jobs have? So it's being really intentional about that. And we are working with the Labor and Workforce Agency on some of the work they're doing all across the state, and in particular Kern County, which is our largest oil producing county in the state, and understanding what are some of the things that we can do to work with community colleges, community organizations, local governments, to think about those transitions. And so in the scoping plan, we basically said we need a transition plan like what I'm describing, so a document that sort of says, here are our challenges, here are some steps we might want to take, here are some regulatory steps, here are some legislative steps that we might want to take. And fortunately, the legislature supported that work and included it in legislation last year, and included some funding for us to do some of the analysis that needs to be done. So our sister agency, the California Energy Commission, is doing an assessment of the fuels that are needed in today's economy and moving forward. And then we are going to take that data and use it as an input into a transition plan. And that transition plan will be created by a working group that will involve labor, it'll involve community organizations, it will involve technical people, it'll involve all of our sister agencies, local governments. And so we are structuring that activity right now. And I think it's going to be really important to have the opportunity to get lots of input from all the different stakeholders from the industry, to understand what are the steps that are needed. And we're starting to see this transition. Right now, 57% of the diesel that is sold in California is renewable diesel. And that's a huge transition. And as we continue to make our fuels more carbon, less carbon intensive, and we increase the use of hydrogen and electric infrastructure to support our transportation system, we want to make sure that we are bringing everybody along in that transition as part of a managed plan to understand, what are the steps we need to take.
Excellent. And I wonder if you would comment, Chair Randolph, just a little bit on the what do you see the timing of that plan rolling out? Obviously, multiple agencies involved, so a complex undertaking.
Yeah, it's going to take at least a year. I think, we're building that working group now, and I am optimistic we will be able to really roll up our sleeves and get moving pretty quickly. But it's going to take time, and we want to make sure that we are considering all of the issues and having it be as complete as possible.
And if you would, what do you think might be some of the biggest obstacles to California sort of pulling this off and beginning to implement a plan like that?
I think there's a lot of challenges. I mean, we have a lot of regulatory levers around reducing demand, but a lot of that depends on consumer uptake. right now we're ahead of all of our goals. We're ahead of our goals in light duty vehicle deployment. We're ahead of our goals in heavy duty vehicle deployment. But we have to make sure that continues and that momentum continues. So that's going to be an important piece of it, right? Making sure that the demand strategies are as effective as possible. Then I think the workforce issues are going to be the most challenging. And I think that's going to take a lot of coordination. And I think it's also going to take some, honestly, some sort of intentionality on the part of climate investors and companies that are doing this work to make sure that they are creating strong jobs, not just, short-term or jobs without solid benefits. They need to really be thinking about how to create the jobs to build that strong, cleaner economy. And I think that's going to be a big challenge as well.
Yes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I am going to turn now to Senator Monique Limón. Senator Limón was a lead co-author of a historic oil and gas setbacks bill, SB 1137, and was elected to the state Senate in November of 2020 and represents the 19th Senate District, which includes Santa Barbara County and half of Ventura County, and is in Southern California, for those not in California. Born and raised in the 19th District, Senator Limón has worked continuously to serve her community as an educator, a leader, and an advocate for causes advancing the quality of life in her community. Before the state Senate, Senator Limón served for 4 years in the California State Assembly, where she chaired the Banking and Finance Committee and was the vice chair of the Legislative Women's Caucus. So Senator Limón, I hope you will talk to us, please, a little bit about the legislation that you helped lead and to establish safety setbacks for oil and gas production from sensitive receptors, and tell us a little bit about what that was like, and also any other policies that you've been aimed at what I would characterize as common sense public safety legislation towards oil and gas. And how hard was it to advance that kind of an initiative? And what do you think is needed to manage the transition with industry?
Thank you, Barry. Great to be here. And I will definitely say that as you chatted just a little bit about my bio, another piece about my bio is that my districts represented oil production for over 150 years. So some of the background that I have and some of the work that I do comes from a place of knowing what it's like to have extractions, pipelines, both inland, offshore. Summerland is a really small area, but most people who study this issue know that it was an area where offshore oil drilling was first tested in the world. And so these are some of the things that really matter and that are part of a history in a district that has had to really grapple with what a managed transition looks like. A history of a community and of a district that welcomed oil production with wide arms, with incentives, with job creation, you name it. And that over 150 years, that feeling in the district has changed because things just haven't gone as well. And some of the ideas that were initial ideas in terms of what it would do for an economy, what it would do for jobs and for the community at large have changed quite a bit. And most of that change regrettably has come from really hard challenges and things that have gone really wrong. So the 1969 oil spill, the largest oil spill off the shore of California, happened off the Santa Barbara coast. We've had spills just as recent as 2015. We have a lot of little ones, but ones that do deep damage. And so my perspective really comes from that perspective, and knowing that it is important to transition, and that transition is very difficult, not just in the community or in the region, but at the state. I have two colleagues that are here, Assemblymember Mark Berman and Assemblymember Jim Wood, who have been in this fight with us, who have voted on all 12 bills that I've had. I've carried 12 oil bills since I've been in the legislature. And that is a lot because you will not see many members carry bills that try to tackle oil. And that is very real. Part of the challenge is that it has been an uphill battle. And just to even have a conversation about what that transition looks like. Do we look at the oil wells? Do we test the oil wells? How many of those do we test? What do we do with, you know, the over 3,000 abandoned oil wells that are not properly abandoned or plugged in the state of California? What do we do with the fact that you have communities like Los Angeles County that has the closest proximity of oil wells to people, and who we see a high percentage of people who suffer health impacts because of some of the contamination. So these are all very, 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 very difficult conversations we had. And Senate Bill 1137, which was, you know, the lead author was Senator Lina Gonzalez from Long Beach, who did an incredible job. I was her joint author on this, established California's first setback bill. Really important to recognize that that is not a novel idea. Texas, Wyoming do setback bills, but California did not have a setback. And so that setback was 3,200 feet, very ambitious in part because we also know that, you know, the time to test new and small things has really escaped us. We are now at a point where we have to actually, when we are moving legislation forward, we're having to do so in a way that maybe is more aggressive than it would have been 50 years ago. And that's in part because, you know, the same reasons that we're all gathered here, you know, in Dubai, because things are not going as well as we'd like for the whole, you know, globe, not just the region or the state of California. It was a very, very difficult bill. I can tell you that I have co-authored that bill multiple times in the 7 years that I've been in the legislature. And it wasn't until last year, until 2022, that we were able to get it out. And what, you know, there were a lot of pieces that came together. There was definitely a legislative interest. So legislators had said, we really do need to have setbacks for quite a bit of time. There was a bill introduced in 2021 that was a 2,500 foot setback. Before there was an 1,000 foot setback previously to that. We had tried, and the bills usually didn't make it past the first hearing of the committee, or were not heard in the committee. And last year, what was different and what I think allowed us to move forward in a more aggressive way was that, one, it was part of a package of bills that addressed climate. And this was a package of bills where you had the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor's office who wanted to push hard collectively at the same time. Sometimes in the legislature, some of those pieces don't align. 2022, they aligned. And so they aligned and we were able to get that, but it was really, really, really difficult. And part of what was difficult was the legislation itself, you know, whether 3,200 feet or some other number was the right number to start with. So we grappled with what is the right number and what is the impact that it will have. And, you know, how does this impact also, you know, jobs? Jobs mean something. And certainly, you know, our labor force has an influence on how we think about some of this transition. And so actually labor was split on this bill. We definitely had some labor opposed, but we had some labor that said, we understand this is coming and this is the time to do it because we need to understand what comes next, right? And I will say that a legislative package was very helpful because while we were able to say, here's an area where we're going to squeeze tight and it's going to feel difficult, we're also going to advance some of the other work in terms of renewable, like wind. And so it was part of this conversation saying, we can't just do one thing that tightens and squeezes and feels really difficult without having something else that we're doing that opens the door and possibility to how we look at a transition. I also ran a bill, also part of, you know, the bigger packages, not maybe the same headlines, but that was about ensuring that some of the work that is done with these abandoned wells that will take us decades to clean up, just to be clear, decades to clean up in the state of California, and how we can ensure that those jobs are jobs that go to our labor force, and that our labor force that's currently doing oil and, you know, and gas, that has experience with pipelines, that has experience with wells, with drilling, are also the right expertise and background to help us plug and abandon these wells throughout the state. So we are trying. I think there is evidence that we are trying. It is very, very difficult. And I would say that there are those in the legislature who are going to keep trying so that we can move more aggressively in this area. But the difficulties that come isn't just with, you know, one single entity opposing. It's the ramifications it has for communities as a whole, for jobs, for communities, you know, the transition itself. The legislature really thinks about what it means to squeeze our, you know, to squeeze and to feel difficult, and what it will mean to the constituents we serve, who, you know, in my district, I have 30,000 commuters that commute from a day, 30,000 commuters a day that commute from one county to the other. I don't have some of the great, amazing public transit that we see in bigger areas. And so that is all very real. We are thinking about what that squeeze means to the people that we represent, but we also know that the people that we represent have been highly impacted by the climate crisis. So whether it's wildfires or floods, and these are folks who are on the coast, who are in my agriculture areas, right? They're in all parts, urban. I mean, you talk about the number of school days now where we have to think about the fact that the, you know, air is so bad near a school, and we can't let the kids go out to play because we have a wildfire that's happening. And I know that, you know, colleagues here, again, know what that's like because they're having even bigger wildfires than the, you know, 800,000 acres that we have, or whatever the fire is, right? They're really, really monster fires. So all of this is something that our community has been living with. And it is because of that that we are pushing to try to advance in the state of California.
Thank you so much, Senator Limón. And I just wanted to acknowledge that Chair Randolph had to leave us. She had another talk to go to. She's got a very full dance card at COP. And I also wanted to comment on something you said, just from kind of a larger perspective of how there's not just the policy that has to be balanced here, right, in terms of supply and demand, and synchronizing those two things so that we don't have huge supply disruptions. But there's also, as you brought in, the politics and balancing the politics, and that's hugely important. I know it is in California. I suspect it is everywhere. So thank you so much. And I am going to turn to the East Coast now, Secretary Serena McIlwain has joined us. She is the Secretary of Environment for the Department of Environmental Protection in Maryland. Secretary McIlwain also served as the Undersecretary at the California Environmental Protection Agency, so she knows California fairly well, and can perhaps show us how things are different on the East Coast and maybe some of the similarities as well. A native of the Washington metro area, Secretary McIlwain also served for the federal government as a senior executive for numerous executive branch agencies, including the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, as Assistant Regional Administrator for Region 9 in San Francisco. And Secretary McIlwain received a Master of Public Administration from George Mason University, a master's degree in Administration and International Studies from Central Michigan University. So Secretary McIlwain, I would love it if you would tell us what are Maryland's goals as compared with the Paris Agreement, and how did Maryland reduce its emissions by 30% since 2006, and where do you see things going?
Thank you, Barry. So happy to be here. And this is so interesting. I'm speaking on behalf of Maryland this time. So I'm speaking on where I'm from. So I'm happy to be on the other side to talk about what Maryland is doing. So in terms of well, first I'll acknowledge that California is doing a whole lot. I was there. I've heard what I've heard so far, and I've been a part of it. And Maryland is, California is definitely leading, but I want to say this, Maryland is leading too. I walked into a state that kind of blew my mind in terms of how aggressive Maryland is and all the things that Maryland has done so far to reduce emissions. And I'll just start with let me just compare it to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement calls for 1.5 C degrees Celsius in terms of keeping the earth from warming. In Maryland, and also as a part of that agreement is in order to reduce emissions by 45, we have to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. In Maryland, we are just stepping on it harder. And so our goal is to reduce emissions by 60% by 2031. And a lot of people think, well, how are you going to do that? And I'm telling you, we are going to do it. Chair Liane Randolph was talking about the scoping plan in Maryland. We too have a plan. It's not a scoping plan, but we have a climate action plan that the legislator required us to push forward. And that plan is about how do we plan to implement the goals of 60% by 2031, as well as zero emissions by 2045, which is more aggressive than the Paris Agreement as well. And so the plan that we're developing now is due December 31st of this. Are we in December yet? Okay.
Yes.
Time is flying, especially in Dubai. I'm ahead now. So closer to this report being due. In the report, we are outlining steps that Maryland will take to meet those aggressive goals. And we're going to focus on building we call it BEPS, building energy performance standards. We're going to focus on EVs, electrifying cars and trucks. We followed California's advanced clean cars and trucks. So that's one of just a couple of things that we're putting in that report in terms of what we need to do to make sure we meet those goals. So it's very aggressive, but I do want to talk about some of the progress that we've made that I've talked about earlier. We are a part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and that's where a lot of, I don't know if you all have heard of RGGI, but it's a cap and invest program on the power plants, coal power plants. And so we've been doing that, and we were a founding member since 2006. And we've reduced emissions by 30% since 2006. So we are already charging ahead. And now we're looking at that same program to see if we can push harder to reduce the cap even tighter, or to make it even tighter. So that's one way we're really looking at reducing emissions and moving forward. So we've been doing that, like I said, since 2006. Going forward, we have a lot of different initiatives that we're pushing. So in terms of the actual transition, I think the problem is with not just Maryland, but just everybody, that transitional plan, like for example, we have the implementation plan that we're pushing out coming soon in December, but how do you actually transition? Like, what is the actual plan? So we have all of these implementation theories and strategies, but industry needs to come up with a plan to transition. So we can't manage the actual transition. We need industry, we need consumers to be a part of it. And so that kind of planning is something that I'm thinking about in Maryland, and that we're moving toward. So that's really where we are in terms of transitioning. So I mentioned RGGI. We're also looking at renewable energy. The governor in Maryland has a goal to reach 100% electric, 100% green energy by 2030. Is it 2030, 2035? That's aggressive as well. And so we're moving toward that. But I'll stop with this. The point is, even though we have all of these strategies and we have the implementation plan, We really need to make sure that we're working with industry, we're funding this transition. And that's what I'm looking at in terms of the plan that we have. How do you fund the transition at this scale? It takes money. And so the fact that the federal government, the Biden administration has poured so much, so billions of dollars into this transition, it's really making it more of a likelihood that we can get there in the years that we're all trying to plan for. But it just takes that scale of investment. So the public partnership is really important. I'm pushing it. I'm working with industry, myself, our administration and my agency. We're trying to find different ways to fund the transition. So that's the challenge that we're having. Really, it's really funding the transition. And in terms of an equitable and just transition, we're focusing on making sure that we're giving more money to low income families and disadvantaged communities. In fact, from the money that we're getting from that RGGI program, we've gotten about $1 billion worth of revenue since 2006. Compared to California, that's not a whole lot, but it's a lot in Maryland. And we get about $150 million a year, yearly with RGGI. And we take that money to fund low-income communities. We use the money particularly to fund or to help offset some of the utility costs. We also use the money to fund some of the green transitions like solar projects and things like that. So we're doing a lot, more to come, but we're right there with California.
You are indeed. And I just want to say, California legislators, take note. Maryland's target is, and tell me if I get this right, Secretary, by 2031, you're going to have a 60% reduction. Do you know what the baseline year is? Is that 2000 or 1990?
It's 2006.
2006, okay.
Yes.
So that's probably like a 55% reduction in California. Right now, California's non-statutory target is by 2030 is 48%. And our target for 100% renewable is 2045. And I believe you said yours was 2035?
45.
45, okay.
So we're the same on that one.
And one last question, which is, do you feel that the IRA funding has changed the conversation already policy-wise and talking about a managed transition plan? Like, are industry partners, well, let me phrase that differently. Are the oil and gas industry partners, because I would not characterize them as partners in California. That's my perspective. So love to hear your comment on that.
Yeah, the IRA, again, because of the investment that's available. So the thing is with the fossil fuel companies, they are part of this transition. So we can't just cut off coal, the power plants, and cut off oil and cut off gas today. We have to have a plan to transition. We have to beef up renewable energy, solar, wind, green hydrogen. IRA has made it possible with all of the funding that's available. And that money is available for industry. And as we all know, when you have the federal government pushing so much funding in the marketplace, that's going to create even more money from industry. And so I think because of, and I said that a little earlier, because of that influx of money with the IRA, it is changing the game. It's trying to help us get to scaling where we need to, but we have so far to go. It's not enough money. Billions of dollars, even 50, 60 billion dollars that's collectively being pushed in the marketplace is nothing compared to the trillions of dollars that's needed to fully transition. And so it's changing the game, but we have so far to go.
It's an ante-in, kind of. Yeah, thank you so much, Secretary McIlwain. Appreciate it. So we're gonna take a very different perspective now. We're gonna come to a more global perspective from Europe, and allow me to introduce Richard Folland, who is our next speaker, the head of policy and engagement at Tracker Initiative and has been Carbon Tracker's policy and government affairs advisor since 2014. Richard has over 30 years of experience as a diplomat and an advocate operating at the highest level, based in Europe, but also elsewhere. He has worked on climate and energy agenda as a policymaker and as a private sector advisor for 15 years. A former head of international energy policy for the UK Foreign Office, Richard has also been JP Morgan's European advisor on energy and climate change, the executive director of, okay, you get the gist. So, question for you, Richard. Please give us your perspective on what they are doing in Europe to address the challenges and opportunities of a just transition or a managed transition. Do you have any additional suggestions on what might be able to do, we could do to accelerate this process? And what would you like to see from this COP?
Wow, the second question's a big question, I think. Hello, everybody. It's great to be a sort of British European interloper, so to speak, here, and it's been very interesting to be informed about what's going on in the US and different parts of the US. I was just sort of trying to think about how I could most helpfully inform this discussion from the European perspective, and I think there were two things. We can maybe get on to COP in due course, Barry, but there are two things that really I wanted to sort of say a little bit about. First, which is about the recognition of the challenge of the transition in Europe, and I think a big takeaway there is for policymakers is you can't leave it to the market, right? You know, that governments, policymakers have got a responsibility there. And then I think from that, maybe picking up on your question there, Barry, you know, showing one or two examples of policy instruments, initiatives that have been taken forward in Europe in terms of addressing the transition. So, you know, I'm not going to go through the litany of what's gone on in Europe, the EU, the UK, when we were part of the EU. We're not anymore, sadly, but there we are. You know, in terms of what Europe has taken forward on decarbonisation, going back as far as the first emissions trading system, carbon pricing in 2005, to setting ambitious renewables targets a decade ago, and we've really seen, you know, progress on that opportunity side, I would say. But a takeaway is also, and I think Europe has sort of woken up to this more over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, the challenges of the transition as well, and of the just and equitable transition. And the key point there is taking people with you, taking the local communities, the local workers, organizations like the trade unions. I think that's something to see there, because, you know, particularly if we think over the last 18 months or so since the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, you know, we've seen a spike in energy prices as well. So thinking of, you know, for policymakers, how to frame the transition in terms of, you know, the impact on consumer energy bills, and as I was saying, around jobs and local communities as well. And I think the key point there is to recognize that challenge. As I said, Europe has come to this over the last few years. And just to give one example of how not to do it, but which actually was leaving it to the market, which is going back to the 1980s in the UK from my country, where basically we closed down the coal mines. It became very controversial, very politically divisive. We saw quite a lot of disorder, you know, the impacts on the different communities in the sort of coal mining areas. And you know, then, you know, this obviously before climate change, any of that was really being considered. But there, the government just did nothing really to help to support these local communities. And the scars are still there 30 to 40 years ago. You know, if you mention the name Margaret Thatcher in certain communities, they to this day will not go down very well because of that it was sort of market-driven, unsupportive, one could say, approach towards supporting those communities. So the second area. So what's Europe been doing in terms of addressing the challenges of the transition? Well, Barry, you talked about balancing the policies and balancing the politics. And, you know, if we see within the EU, I mean, certain communities, countries, take Poland, for example, heavily dependent on coal and coal power, something like 80% still of the energy mix. And their, you know, recognition, the Poland, Polish workers and so on are going to have those challenges in terms of the transition. So a major initiative that the EU instigated starting from 2021 was, you talked about money, a just transition fund. Really important, you know, not only in terms of providing that on the ground support, but also to demonstrate again, policymakers, we get this. It's not just simply that matter of the market sort of, you know, driving things forward, that, you know, we've got a responsibility here in terms of, you know, that managed transition. I mean, another example, thinking about the EU carbon pricing system, the emissions trading system, thinking about those industries which are going to be most affected, you know, the heavy sort of the heavily carbonized, carbon intensive industries, ones which are going to take longer to transition. You know, what can be done in terms of supporting them? Maybe the carbon pricing is not so difficult for those industries. And I think the other point I just wanted to make here, actually, which I'm hoping we're going to see more from Europe, actually, REGI, which you talked about. I mean, I think the EU emissions trading system could learn from REGI, in fact, because it's a cap and trade system, not cap and invest. And what they've not really done so far is thinking, right, what can we do to allocate those revenues from carbon pricing to, you know, in terms of, again, of addressing energy bills and so on for those at least able to handle. And I think that's something that the EU is going to come forward with more. I'll stop there. I mean, very happy to come back to the COP as well. But I mean, I suppose the only point I would make there just on that is, question is how much can be done in terms of the COP as opposed to really the responsibility of national governments and policymakers in this area. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Richard. I have a quick follow-up question for you, which is the transition fund that has been established. How is that being funded? And I also just want to underline what you said about how important it is for revenues, whatever the source is, of really addressing the people most hurt in this transition economically.
Right. So I did make a note of the just transition mechanism, the fund. So that's over 6 years, from 2021 to 2027. And that's a nearly 20 billion euro fund. I mean, and it's coming out of, you know, the European Union is funded by its member states. You know, so there's all paying into that, making different contributions depending on, you know, how rich a country you are. And so it's coming out of general, you know, EU funding, so to speak. But I think the point here is that it's over this 6-year period, and so it can be allocated over that time, basically. I think the other point here is it comes back to sort of having that plan, you know, to show how you're going to be addressing it, you know, over sort of major part of this decade.
Well, thank you so much. And it's great to hear that that's happening in Europe. And I think it's something that we can also in the United States take a page from that book. You know, we definitely need something to finance this. So our final speaker, last but by no means least, Colin Rees, is the United States Program Manager for Oil Change International, where he works to support grassroots resistance against dirty infrastructure and public support for oil and gas and coal, and wind down fossil fuel production with a just and equitable transition. He has campaigned on climate and racial justice, labor issues, and new economic models for over a decade, spanning local and international levels. Prior to joining Oil Change, Colin built power of the fossil fuel divestment movement at 350.org and trained youth to run campaigns with the Energy Action Coalition. Trained as a mechanical and material science engineer at Harvard University, he previously worked in President Barack Obama's White House Council on Environmental Quality and is a board member at youth advocacy group Sustain Us. So, Colin, what are the most important takeaways you think regarding the status of a transition away from fossil fuels? And you can start with the United States if you like on that. And how are we doing on phasing out supply relative to demand, and what are what pitfalls remain ahead of us? And I'll stop there. I've got some more questions for you, but I'll stop there. And Colin, slides, yes, are up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barry, and thank you to this incredible panel. I think a lot of it fits really well, and it's, for me, encouraging to see the sorts of things that I have worked on for many years being implemented in really real ways, and the strong political leadership that we've had. So I will be talking here primarily about the US at a federal level, a bit about California as well, and some of the work that's happening there. But this first graph, I got 4 scary graphs probably, but this first one is a bit of a scary one. This is specifically looking at the top countries in projected expansion of oil and gas production over the next 8 years to 2030. You'll notice the US is a lot higher than anybody else in this graph. We are in fact responsible for well over 1/3 of total planned oil and gas expansion. This, to be very clear, I want to distinguish this from a graph that's going to come, because this is still projected production yet to be expanded. This is stuff that does not have to come to pass, that can still be stopped if there's the bold political leadership needed to make that happen, and the managed transition to facilitate that from happening. But the point here is that we're going the wrong way on fossil fuel supply. Even as we are beginning to bend the curve on fossil fuel demand, on bringing down emissions in some parts of the world and some parts of the country, we are still massively ramping up fossil fuel production. And as I'll talk about, a lot of that is actually going into fossil fuel export. So in that case, it no longer counts on the US ledgers. Chair Randolph brought this up in the context of California, but it still very much counts for the atmosphere. The climate doesn't care where the carbon comes from. And so that mismatch between where we are starting to get to on demand, to be clear, we're not where we need to be in terms of reducing fossil fuel consumption, but we are a lot further along than actually phasing out fossil fuel production, where things are not nearly in as good of a shape. Can I get next slide? So the reason that is so key, and one of the animating factors for oil changes work and the work that I do is what's represented here. This is a graph of an entirely different set of fossil fuels. This is fossil fuels already under production. So you see coal on the left, oil and gas in the center there, and then if you add them both together, well, you get what's on the right. The red dotted lines there are very important. We're sitting in a pathways to 1.5 booth. The bottom one here is 1.5. If we stop burning any coal tomorrow and burn only the oil and gas already in production, that would take us past 1.5. That's not going to happen. Obviously, nobody is talking about turning the taps off tomorrow. The whole point of a managed transition is we need a plan to get there in a swift but just timeline. That means we're going to have to leave a lot of this oil and gas in the ground, and that's in wells that are already drilled. And so to bring it back, everything I showed you on that past page, but that big red bar with the US, a massive amount of fossil fuels still to be expanded, none of that is even here. That bar is just going to make each one of these taller here if we don't do something to stop it. So that's the context for why we're going the wrong way and why the US is kind of leading the pack in a really negative way. And to be clear, we'll talk about equity in a sec, but the US, Canada, United Kingdom, Norway, and Australia are what we just put out a report called Planet Wreckers. Not so subtle, but those 5 countries together are responsible for more than half of planned expansion of oil and gas. These are countries which are saying good things in many ways, have been pretty decent voices at the UN climate talks in terms of pushing for a fossil phase out in the text, et cetera, but they're not getting it done at home. And so to bring it back to what Richard said, that's the huge mismatch here, and the one that's going to create a weird. Senator Limón talked about the squeeze. I think it's a squeeze. It's a squeeze. We know who that impacts. It's going to impact working people. It's going to impact communities impacted by this extraction in really negative ways. Next slide, please. And so to just underscore the difference here, This is a recent analysis we did using data from the Rhodium Group, which is an energy consultancy, and it's some of the first analysis that's come out of U.S. energy and emissions productions under the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is a seminal climate bill in the U.S. It is not everything that we need, but it is one of the best climate bills we've gotten to date, particularly on the demand side. But I think the key thing to notice here is that the Inflation Reduction Act does intentionally, I would say, as somebody who was somewhat involved in advocacy throughout the development of the bill, they were very clear that they were not attempting to do anything about fossil fuel production, fossil fuel supply. And so what you're seeing here is that even as gas and oil demand in the United States come down over the next 15 years to 2035, gas and oil production actually increase. That's in the middle there. And that difference almost entirely goes to exports, a massive spike in gas exports, LNG exports in particular, as well as a very concerning increase in oil exports. And I'll add, the US is already the world's leading producer of oil and gas, and by far the leading gas exporter, and we're set to double that over the next 15 years if we're not doing anything additional. So the main point here is, we can talk about the IRA all day, but the main point is that it's not a comprehensive suite of policies in itself, and that we need additional and targeted policies to specifically address fossil fuel supply. Because if we don't have a managed transition plan to phase down supply and demand together, we're going to be in deep trouble. So that's the piece there. Yeah, you can keep coming. The one other thing I wanted to mention, well, I'll go to the graph because we're here. This is a graph from one of our latest reports as well, and this is about equity. I think equity is really important when we're talking about how we're phasing out the supply of fossil fuels. It is, of course, something that gets brought up in the context of phasing out demand and consumption of fossil fuels as well. That's a really animating part of the climate talks. As we are now finally starting to talk at a global, at a national, at a state level about phasing out fossil fuel production, I think we need a really intentional conversation about equity, about who is phasing out first and fastest, who has the capacity to do so, who has the least economic dependency on oil and gas. That's not a perfect measure, but that's essentially what the measures are here. The capacity to fund a fair and fast transition is the vertical axis, and the degree of economic dependence on oil and gas is on the bottom. So you see those 5 planet wreckers that I mentioned, the United States, UK, Australia, Canada, and Norway are in the top left, meaning oil and gas is not a big part of their economy currently, and they have a lot of money to be able to fund that transition, to be able to transition a workforce, to be able to help impacted communities. Within the United States, it won't shock many of you to know that California is also in the top left of this graph, essentially, as is probably Maryland. But I do think it's really critical to note that there are many layers here. Within the United States, the Gulf South is a very different context than California in terms of extraction. Within California, Bakersfield and Kern County is a very different context than a couple places where there might be a couple wells remaining or some of the offshore. So it doesn't mean that everything in California has to end tomorrow. That's not what we're saying at all, but it does mean that California and the US more broadly have a responsibility to be phasing out first and fastest and to be leading politically on this. And so I think I'll close with the importance of political leadership. I think from California and from others, I'm sitting next to one of my heroes, Senator Limón, we have seen incredible leadership already, and we need to see that at all levels of government. I'm particularly thinking of how, even as this is something that I've worked on and I'm excited about, even as oil and gas production has continued to decline in California alongside important demand side measures under the Newsom administration, who has done many good things on climate. I have some quibbles, but largely been a positive force. Even under Newsom, we've seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of new permits for oil and gas wells since he took office. And we can quibble, it is very important, that is material, especially to the communities impacted, but it is safe to say on a national level, California doesn't have a massively material amount of production. Most of the increase I've talked about is happening in the Gulf South, it's happening in New Mexico and Texas. I say that just because phasing out the remaining parts of California's oil production and refining, et cetera, is both important in itself, and it's not going to change those graphs in a huge way, but the political impact of California being a leader, of showing how that managed transition works, of doing it in a way that doesn't lean into false solutions, into kind of carbon capture schemes and other things that allow the industry to retain its political power. Those are the things that get noticed. Those are the things that other countries can look to that actually help move the fossil fuel phase out forward more than just words on a page. Is if you have key jurisdictions like California, we're not there yet, but in a world in which the United States would do the same thing, that's how we actually catalyze this managed transition, is by working on both supply and demand, and kind of proving that leadership with the results on the ground.
Thank you so much, Colin. And I just want to check in with the Climate Registry and see if I can take a couple of questions from the audience. I'm not seeing. Yes? Yeah. Okay. Great. So, any questions for the audience for our panelists? Assemblymember Wood.
Thank you. Odd question maybe, but start thinking about the shocking amount of increase of production that we're doing, especially in the United States. Has anybody done any studies on where we would be had we not begun transitioning towards other fuel sources and other sources of energy? In other words, how bad would it be?
It's a good question, and I don't pretend I haven't done that research myself. I think it's safe to say that our percentage of oil and gas in particular that has been exported has been rising over time. We have, especially since the fracking boom of the early 2000s, that production has really skyrocketed, and a lot of that production has just been shipped straight overseas. I think there's an important conversation there too around the ways in which US geopolitical power is kind of I'm not taking away agency from other countries, but what the US industry and government is doing is working in tandem to hook other countries on fossil fuels to make this transition that much harder for the rest of the world. To your question specifically, I mean, I think we would probably be using more of that production. We would certainly still be using more fossil fuels. I haven't looked at those exact hypotheticals. We've done another version of the study that I mentioned, which looked at even if the US kind of fully implemented a Green New Deal, this was a few years ago when that was kind of the big topic of discussion, even if at the federal level we had a Green New Deal and we got to zero emissions by 2030, fossil fuel production was essentially unchanged. I think gas production actually increased. Like, that is still being set up for export. And so this is the result of global energy dynamics, but also the dynamics of an industry that is very much always looking to the future, always looking for an escape route, setting itself up so that even if the political conditions change in its home country, it has a way to get that product to market. And so I think that's why it's so important to be planning this transition further out than a 4-year administration, further out than an 8-year administration, to be planning for what it looks like to get all the way to the end, because otherwise things could change in a bad way.
You want to say something, Richard? Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add one point. This might not answer your question as far as the US is concerned, but for years, the International Energy Agency, they've set out scenarios on emissions pathways, basically. So, you could go back and see what they were saying, I don't know, say 5 years ago, something like that, when less ambitious global policies at the national level were in place. And, they have new policies, stated policies, etc. I think they're probably as good as you can get in terms of, emissions reduction pathways, but might not then go into the on the production side.
Great. Assemblymember Berman.
Thank you, and thanks everyone. Are there any other communities or countries across the world that are providing a good model for that just transition that still supports the local kind of economic base, workforce base, and doesn't decimate local communities like we've seen in some communities across the country or across the world?
I mean, possibly Richard can speak to this more. I think I've definitely been inspired by the Spanish coal transition, among others. That is something, a new government came in, worked really closely with trade unions and communities impacted by coal pits, coal mines, coal plants, and laid out a not comprehensive is a big word, but like a pretty extensive plan involving workforce transitions, new trainings and development, early retirements, essentially meeting the communities where they were at, but with a firm statement essentially that coal was over, that there was not going to be any more expansion, that this was an industry in decline. And when everybody was working on the same page with that understanding, I think it perhaps made it a lot easier to actually get it. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a really good example on oil and gas yet. We've seen some companies make a full transition to renewable energy, although they're the vanishing minority. But I think some of the coal transitions has gone poorly in some places, I think, or not in a way that works for communities. But I think the Spanish one is usually a pretty good example.
Yeah, I think that's a good point as well, because Spain has got this burgeoning renewables, wind and solar industry as well. And so you can see the impact there. I'm sort of wondering about a South American country that might have done a little bit. I don't know, is Chile a little bit? Yeah, maybe. But I think you're right, Colin. There's nobody who's yet really been able to sort of say we, particularly, an oil and gas producer. And if you take the UK and Norway, and I was interested to see you put both of them up there, and I think very good that you're doing that as well. And personally, I'm quite ashamed that the UK is looking to sort of issue more oil and gas licenses when that is not something that we should be doing. But I think that oil and gas industry, that challenge is still to come. And I would come back to the point there about the trade unions, at least over in Europe. There's a bit of a challenge there, I know, in the UK, for example.
Okay, Bunny.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Those graphs at the end really floored me, and quite frankly, I'm frightened. But getting to your point about California's outweighed impact, what types of policies should we as a state be looking at to really reduce that dependence and really fight the political power that the oil industry still has?
That's a great question, and I'd love everybody to respond to that if you would. And Secretary McIlwain, you want to start us off on that?
Okay, so the question is, what do we do to reduce the demand? And what was the question?
Policies.
What kind of policy should we look at to reduce the political impact?
Oh, that's a tough one. Oh boy. I'm gonna pass for a second.
Yeah.
I want to be politically correct.
Yeah, it's tough. It's a tough question.
I got ideas. I mean, I think first and foremost, it's been mentioned here over and over and over. We need our brothers and sisters in the trades to be on board. First and foremost, I think that is one of the biggest, pieces that I've seen, both at kind of the micro level of like, if you're running a bill, who's your opposition? And if you have the industry and labor, it's going to be a significantly harder bill. If you have industry alone, it's a different type of a challenge. So I think it's recognizing that we have, partners in this that we work really well with on other issues. And so we want to bring them to the table. I also think, changing the narrative to, and this is really difficult, and at times because we don't have enough, investments that we make compared to the opposition in terms of financial investments to buy the narrative or in terms of what it is. But the narrative has to be about our constituents. That is, I think, why we are elected. It is about them. And so we must at all times, and I think it's been said here, bring people along at every point of this conversation. When people feel that it's, only a county that's coastal versus a, Central Valley, there are pieces that are challenging to all communities, no matter where you represent, but also ensuring that we're able to articulate that and what those challenges are, but also what the benefits are. I think one of the things that's helped us in the last 2 years in California has really been that part of, tightening and squeezing has come with a promise of good jobs in renewables, specifically in wind. In Assemblymember Wood's district, it's going to be huge, but we have to deliver on that. We have to deliver. And what we have to deliver is not just being able to create the jobs, but they have to be good jobs and they have to be sustainable, right? Not good jobs that are there for a decade and then go away. And so that is really, really key. I think in California, another piece is we have gotten more intentional about ensuring that the talk, that the leads don't reflect just one population, but a multitude of populations. One of the things that California has started to do is, for example, work with our tribal communities much more in this conversation. We have a conversation around the wind stuff as the wind energy projects right now as it's going, as it relates to some of sanctuaries, right? Marine sanctuaries, and our tribal communities are more involved. So some of our communities, our indigenous communities, are environmental justice communities that look more like the whole state, have been coming to the table more, and traditionally they hadn't. Right. And or they hadn't been given a spot at the table. And so now we are more, I think, intentional about ensuring that whether it's, economic diversity, geographic diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity. There's a study coming out in California about the impact of climate, particularly on women, and women having to be dislocated so much because of the impacts. I mean, all of these things are pieces we're talking about, and all of them mean something and matter in a deep way to different communities, and different communities coming together to be able to push for this is greater power for us to get through some really historical financial challenges and burdens that come right in front of us to be able to do this.
Thank you, Senator Limón. Richard.
So I think that's a great question. I would actually say demand greater accountability of the industry. I mean, Carbon Tracker, we do a lot of scrutiny of the international oil companies, both in Europe and in North America, of their business plans, and what are they doing in particular when they say that they are aligning with 1.5 degrees. Now, to be honest, excuse my French, is bullshit. The only company really, which is maybe to some extent, this is because they have plans to reduce their oil and gas production, is BP. And the rest of them are really not there at the moment. So, it's greenwashing essentially. So demanding greater accountability. And there's quite a lot that's been done in the EU and the UK in terms of more disclosure, reporting around this. I'm not too sure, what you have in California or Maryland in this area, but I would say that for the legislators and the policymakers really demand greater accountability of the industry.
Yeah, all fantastic ideas. I don't know that I have too much to add. I think three things that come to mind when you say that are on the political leadership side. I think in California specifically, announcing that end to new oil and gas permits, if it's functionally happening anyway, I think there's huge political impact to actually saying it and owning it. And it would be hugely politically popular. So ending new oil and gas permits and moving up that phase out timeline. I think currently the governor committed to 2045. We think that should be more like early 2030s. So pushing for that leadership. That would also allow California to join the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance as a full member. That's something that was launched in Glasgow a couple years ago with California as an associate member, specifically because they're still permitting some new oil and gas permits. But being able to join BOGA as a full member and take on that global leadership role, I think would be huge. And then the second piece is along the lines of what Richard mentioned. I think stigmatizing the fossil fuel industry and specifically keeping them out of material conversations about our energy future. There's been a lot of fantastic work with politicians rejecting fossil fuel donations, kind of getting that political money out of the system. I think we're in a room with a few people who have done that. But then the other thing that I think is really coming to mind for me is the false solutions conversation. These ideas like dirty hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, things which some amount of carbon capture could theoretically be useful for very hard to abate industrial sectors. Nobody is denying that per se, but what the industry is doing is taking that, twisting it, essentially using it to justify business as usual, claiming that we'll be able to abate or capture kind of all future emissions, and so we can keep producing fossil fuels, setting aside the massive environmental justice impacts of a statement like that. None of that does anything to actually reduce the extraction. In fact, it just increases the infrastructure. Even from a climate standpoint, we know it doesn't work. and they know it doesn't work. The whole point is to delay, and to keep themselves in the room as legitimate voices on energy policy. And I think we need a clear mandate and a clear decision from our leaders that they are not legitimate voices here. These are not businesses who have shown any interest in actually being a part of this transition, and so they should be wholly excluded, and we should reject those false solutions.
Thank you,
Go ahead,
Colin.
something.
You want to bring us home,
Yeah, I'll
Secretary? Thank you.
I'll bring us home. I just want to say that I think we need to focus a lot more on renewable energy because the demand is still there. And so the more we pour more money into renewable infrastructure, like again, wind, solar, green hydrogen, there's not enough money at scale to make it easy to transition. And so I think just federal policy, state policy, worldwide policy, we need to really focus more on the renewable side. That I think that's going to be key. The second thing is building that partnership with industry. Our governor, Westmore in Maryland, he says it, and I believe it. We need to do this by leaving no one behind. The economy is the economy. So fossil fuels is a part of the economy. So we have to look at ways to do it together, partner together to transition away from fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see we do have one. Is it a quick question, Matt, or? Because we're really a little over time. But,
Maybe I'll put it out there for further conversation around. But one of the things that when we come here, a lot of the conversation is about the responsibility that wealthier countries have to countries that are being dramatically in parts of the world dramatically devastated right now by our actions or our emissions. And I wonder if there's any conversation in California or Maryland or for any of us who are from these sort of subnational areas that are contributing so much to these impacts, of what our role is in the conversation around losses and damages and the immediate mitigation of climate impacts across the world. Obviously, we have that in our own states and our own regions, and that's where most of our conversation is. But how, as a state, do we engage in that international conversation? Other than obviously reducing our emissions, transitioning to renewable, of course, but right now, folks are saying that's great, but we have immediate devastation that we need support in addressing, and I don't know if California's engaged at all in that conversation directly. Or Maryland.
So, can you keep it a 30-second
I
one?
will just quickly say that in California, we have different metrics to measure impact. One is the CalEnviro screen, and I say this because there's two members of our Bay Area caucus that don't love it. But there are different ways, and that's a different conversation, right? But there's different ways we track that. And some of those, by tracking it, we also make certain state funds that we allocate through budget allocations more accessible and prioritize to some of the communities that are most impacted. I don't think we have it perfect. I think that there's work to do, and there's ongoing discussions about what that right metric is to measure what communities are most impacted. The CalEnviro screen certainly looks not just at the environmental impact, but also just the communities at large. And so more to come, but there's at least something in place that probably needs some fine tuning.
Yeah. Secretary McIlwain, did you want to say a quick thing about that? Okay, great. So I'm just going to try and summarize the question before that, because I think that's kind of went to the heart of the issue. So what I heard was we didn't need to do a lot of things simultaneously. We need to invest in renewables, right? That's gonna deal with the demand issue, and we have to continue to do that. Let's understand that we're doing a better job on that side than the supply side, but we got a long ways to go. We need to partner with industry, and at the same time, we need to hold industry accountable. From Richard and Colin. And Colin, you may have this statistic in your back pocket. The last I read, the oil and gas industry is responsible for 1% of international investment in the solar industry, 1%. So they're not being an accountable partner at the moment. And then on the other side, on the political side, I think we heard from Senator Limón that we really need to engage our constituencies. We need to bring in labor and work with them and bring them along, and maybe create politically a wedge between them and the industry. And we need to bring in environmental justice communities, communities that are most impacted by this, are going to be even more impacted by this transition. So thank you all. This is an incredibly wonderful discussion. I really appreciate all of your perspectives and the work you're doing. And let's give our panelists a hand. And also the Climate Registry. Thank you, everyone.
Let's stand. Yeah.